Number 12. STG-44. Snow bites your face as a German infantryman fumbles a curved 30-round magazine into a rifle that is not supposed to exist. The stock is cold. The stamped metal is rough. The cartridge is shorter than the old 7.92 rounds he trained on. Then the line ahead erupts. He does not fire like a man with a bolt-action rifle, pausing, working the action, exposing himself. He keeps the sights up and the bursts controlled, reaching farther than a submachine gun ever could. For one brutal moment, this feels like the future arriving in the middle of a collapsing war. But even here, in the weapon's best possible scene, the contradiction is already hiding in plain sight. Too late, too uneven, too few, wrapped in renamings and political theater before it became the STG-44. Number 1. A rifle handed to a soldier in the winter of 1944 when Germany was already running out of time. The weapon in his hands has a 37-inch frame and weighs about 10.2 pounds loaded. Heavy enough to feel solid, light enough to move faster than the rifles that had defined infantry combat for decades. It feeds from a roughly 30-round detachable magazine, and that alone changes the rhythm of the battlefield. No endless bolt cycling, no single shot, then another, with the shooter exposing himself again and again to get back on target. This one lets him stay low, stay moving, and send fire in controlled bursts. But the rifle did not arrive as a clean invention. It came out of a chain of renamings and disguises, the kind of bureaucratic camouflage that tells you the real fight was never just on the front line. First, it was the MKB-42H, then MP-43, then MP-44. Only late in 1944 did it finally receive the name STG-44, a name that made it sound less like a gun and more like a declaration. Sturmgewehr, assault rifle. The words mattered. They gave the weapon a public identity Hitler had not wanted at first, and a political meaning that went far beyond the steel and wood in a soldier's hands. But on the ground, none of that mattered as much as the round it fired. The 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge was shorter than the old full-power rifle round, and that was the point. It gave infantry something in between, more reach than a submachine gun, more controllability than a full rifle. In the snow and smoke, that balance felt like an answer to a problem everyone could already see. The soldier works the magazine into place, hears the catch, and brings the rifle up again. Around him, the front is breaking into fragments. There are walls with holes punched through them, tree lines stripped raw, and men who have learned to move in short dashes because standing still means being seen. The STG-44 fits that kind of war almost too well. It is designed for the distances where most infantry fights actually happen, not the idealized long-range marksmanship of parade ground doctrine. Troops liked it quickly, especially on the Eastern Front, where the battlefield often collapsed into sudden contact, smoke, and mud. The weapon makes sense in the hand before it ever makes sense in a report. And yet the reports are already the problem. Production between 1943 and 1945 never settled into the kind of smooth industrial flow a miracle weapon would need. The early MKB-42H run reached roughly 8,000 to 12,000 units, enough to prove the idea, nowhere near enough to transform an army. Quality was uneven. Some rifles left the factories rough and rushed, with the marks of a system trying to force modernity out of shortages and panic. The war economy did not cooperate. It could not. By the time the STG-44 entered the name in 1944, Germany was already losing ground, losing air superiority, losing the initiative, losing the ability to turn promising hardware into a battlefield cure. So in the field, what the soldier feels and what the Reich can sustain are two different realities. He can fire farther than a submachine gun and faster than a bolt-action rifle. He can carry a weapon that looks and behaves like the future. But the future is arriving inside a collapsing present. Every burst he sends downrange depends on a supply chain that is fraying, a factory system under strain, and a command structure trying to rename desperation into genius. Historians keep coming back to the STG-44 because it was not fake, and it was not useless. It was genuinely influential. But influence is not victory. A weapon can change the shape of combat and still arrive too late to change the shape of the war. He advances through the wreckage, the curved magazine jutting below the rifle like a promise the Reich can no longer cash. The weapon feels different from the long rifles that came before it, and different from the spray and pray image people would later attach to automatic fire. This is controlled, measured, close enough to matter, far enough to survive. The STG-44 was built for the kind of fighting Germany actually faced, not the kind it had imagined in earlier years. It was a practical answer, born too late to become a strategic one. In the winter dust of 1944 and the ruins of 1945, that difference decides everything. When the war ends, one surviving example will sit far from this frozen line, preserved in the Smithsonian collection like a witness taken out of time. Not a triumph, not a failure in the simple sense. Just the first assault rifle to be named as one, and a weapon whose fame arrived after the battlefield had already moved on. Number 11. Maus tank. On May 14, 1943, Ferdinand Porsche stood before Adolf Hitler as a full-size wooden mock-up of a new German tank loomed in front of them. It was not a field improvisation. It was not a desperate garage machine. It was a state project, born in paperwork and approved at the top. The order had begun the year before, in 1942, when Porsche received the contract for a 100-ton super-heavy tank meant to answer a fear growing inside the German command, that Soviet armor would keep getting tougher, faster, and harder to kill. By the time Porsche's answer reached Hitler's eyes, the machine had already swollen past the original idea. What stood there in wood was the outline of something closer to a mobile bunker than a tank. Porsche was not a nobody dragged into fantasy by accident. He was one of Germany's most famous engineers, a man with prestige, connections, and the kind of technical confidence that made giant machines seem not just possible, but inevitable. That matters because the Maus was not designed by fools who could not draw. It was designed by people who could build almost anything, but not under the conditions Germany had created for itself. Krupp took responsibility for the turret and armor. The demands kept expanding. The armor thickened. The gun grew. The concept hardened into a machine that promised invulnerability in theory and punishment in steel. By 1943, the later design centered on a 128mm main gun, a weapon sized for killing enemy armor at long range with grotesque overmatch. And around it came protection on a scale that turned the whole project into an engineering dare. When the completed prototype reached its reported fighting weight, it was around 188 tons. That is the number that breaks the scene open. A Tiger I weighed roughly 57 tons, a Tiger II around 69. The Maus did not simply exceed them. It entered another category entirely. It was so heavy that ordinary military language starts to sound silly around it. Tank is accurate, but it feels inadequate, like calling a fortress a vehicle because it technically has tracks. You can see why Hitler liked the idea. Germany in 1943 was losing the luxury of balance, so the regime kept reaching for extremes. Bigger bomb, bigger gun, bigger promise. And Porsche, who had spent years around ambitious, politically charged projects, kept pushing the machine forward because that was the logic of the system now. If enemy tanks are dangerous, build something they cannot penetrate. If the front is unstable, build something psychologically overwhelming. If reality is closing in, answer it with scale. But scale was the trap. A tank does not fight on a blueprint. It fights on roads, over bridges, through mud, around craters, inside a fuel economy, beneath aircraft, under repair schedules, and at the end of a supply line. So every ton of armor that made the Maus look unbeatable in a presentation made it more vulnerable everywhere else. The machine's problem was not simply that it was late. The problem was that its own mass attacked its reason for existing. Imagine Porsche watching this become concrete. The Reich wants a breakthrough weapon, but the war economy behind it is already buckling under bombing, shortages, and shifting demands. Steel is precious, fuel is precious, transport capacity is precious, trained crews are precious. Yet here is a design that consumes all of them on a scale almost too absurd to grasp. You do not hide 188 tons. You do not move it casually. You do not send it over any bridge and assume the bridge will still agree to be a bridge. That is why the open question around the Maus has always been slightly wrong. People ask whether it might have dominated the battlefield if Germany had solved the powertrain and mobility issues. But mobility was not a side issue. Mobility was the battlefield. A tank that cannot reliably get to the fight, cross the terrain, be maintained in the field, and be recovered when damaged is not a dominant weapon waiting for refinement. It is an ambush laid by mathematics against its own crew. Still, Porsche got far enough to make it real. Testing vehicles followed in 1944. 2 pre-production Maus vehicles were completed. Not dozens, not a battalion. 2. They were delivered to the Kummersdorf testing ground in late 1944, when Germany was already bleeding from every direction. By then, the contrast had become almost painful. On one side, this colossal machine, layered in armor, armed with a 128mm gun, built to dominate a battlefield of open maneuver. On the other, the actual Germany of late 1944, short on fuel, under air attack, scrambling to move men and machines through a collapsing transport network. So Porsche's Giant reached the phase that many wonder weapons reached, the test range. Not triumph. Not mass production. A holding pen between promise and uselessness. At Kummersdorf, the Maus could demonstrate motion. It could prove parts of the concept. It could show that engineers had, in fact, forced this monstrous thing into existence. But a test ground is kind. It does not bomb your rail junctions. It does not leave you stranded at a broken bridge with enemy aircraft overhead. It does not ask how you recover 188 tons after a drivetrain failure. It does not ask how many ordinary tanks, trucks, guns, or locomotives vanished into the appetite of one machine built to solve everything by being larger than the problem. And this is where Porsche's story darkens. He had chased the prestige logic of total war engineering all the way to its endpoint. A vehicle so armored, so armed, so immense that it became a monument to the difference between technical possibility and military usefulness. Germany had not built a decisive new tank. It had built a relic in advance. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced, German crews destroyed both Maus vehicles before they could be captured intact. That act tells you almost everything. These machines were too valuable to surrender, too impractical to save, and too cumbersome to escape. So they were blown up by the side they were meant to rescue. The weapon that had been conceived as an answer to Soviet armor ended its German life not in combat, but in demolition charges laid by Germans themselves. The Soviets found the remains anyway. Later, they took the turret from one vehicle and the hull from the other and combined them into a single hybrid machine. That hybrid was hauled to Kubinka, where it still survives. Not an intact battlefield veteran, a reconstruction from wreckage, a giant assembled after the fact, like evidence in a trial. And tucked far from there, in Britain, even the Tank Museum's optical gun sight from the project feels like a small surviving organ from a body that never really lived. So when you look at the Maus now, you are not looking at the future that failed to deploy by bad luck. You are looking at a weapon that won every argument on paper and lost every argument that mattered once steel met distance, fuel, roads, and time. The Maus was not merely too late, or too heavy, or too ambitious. It was operationally self-defeating from the moment its promise required the world to bend around 188 tons of theory. And the closest thing it left to a final verdict was not heroic at all, just brutally practical. Blown up before Soviet capture. Number 10. E-100 tank. In April 1945, American troops entered the Haustenbeck test area near Paderborn and found what should have been one of the most terrifying armored vehicles of the war. It sat out in the open. A giant hull, huge road wheels, the blunt geometry of a machine built to overmatch whatever stood in front of it. Later captions made it sound simple. Germany's next super tank, the E-100. The near mythical answer after the Maus, a 136-ton land battleship that, if the war had lasted a little longer, might have reached the battlefield with 200 millimeters of frontal armor and a 128 millimeter KWK-44 gun. In the myth, this is the one that nearly made it. The secret monster caught half a step before deployment. But look at what the Americans actually found. Not a finished tank, not even close. At Haustenbeck, they found an incomplete prototype hull under assembly at a test site, not a production line. No heroic factory, no rows of completed vehicles, no rushed battalion issue. Just a partly built machine in a place that already hinted at failure. Haustenbeck was improvised, out of the way, half hidden by the chaos of a collapsing Reich. The most revealing number here may not be 128 millimeters or 200 millimeters. It may be 3. By late in the project, only 3 Adler employees were assigned to assembling the prototype. 3 men on a super-heavy breakthrough tank in 1945. That is not mobilization. It is triage. The myth says the E-100 was Germany's final giant, held back only by timing. The paperwork says something narrower and stranger. Its roots go back to March 5th and 6th, 1942, when Hitler ordered a 100-ton tank to be rapidly developed as a trial vehicle. That sounds like the start of another megalomaniac monster, and in one sense, it was. But the E-100 was also tied to the E-series idea, the German push for standardized designs. That part matters. This machine was not meant to be pure fantasy. It was meant to simplify, reuse components. Avoid building an entirely fresh industrial base. That is why the E-100 keeps showing up in discussions alongside Tiger and Maus parts, instead of as a clean sheet beast dropped from nowhere. The promise was not only more armor, it was more armor without rebuilding the whole system from scratch. Look at that claim closely. A simplified, super-heavy tank. Even saying it out loud feels unstable. By March 1944, Adler submitted blueprint 021A38300. On paper, the design had all the ingredients of battlefield supremacy. A frontal hull up to 200 millimeters thick, a planned heavy turret, a 128 millimeter KWK-44L/55 as the main gun. In some proposals, even a secondary 7.5 centimeter KWK-L/24 mounted above it. That pairing sounds almost absurd now, but it shows what the designers were chasing. A machine that could crush heavy armor and still deal with softer targets without wasting its main round. In raw specification terms, it looked devastating. Now strip away the legend and test the numbers like evidence. Start with the weight. Later summaries commonly place the completed design around 136 tons. The exact figure shifts by source and configuration, but whether you call it 130, 136, or something in that range, the problem stays the same. At that mass, every ordinary military movement becomes a negotiation with reality. Roads crack, bridges become suspect. Rail transport turns into a planning crisis, not a convenience. Recovery becomes its own nightmare. Fuel demand swells, spare parts get heavier. Workshops need different cranes, different clearances, different assumptions. A tank like this does not simply join an army, it forces the army to bend around it. Germany in 1944 and 1945 was no longer a state capable of calmly bending anything. Factories were under pressure, transport was breaking down, fuel was disappearing, skilled labor was thinning out. So the central sales pitch of the E-100 was already at war with itself. It promised overwhelming battlefield force. It also promised industrial rationality. Those ideas stop fitting together once the machine passes 100 tons. By the time you are pushing toward 136, simplification sounds less like a solution and more like camouflage. You can see that in the assembly story. The E-100 did not move through a confident production chain. It limped forward. Adler took over work on the prototype in 1944 after the earlier Tiger Mouse effort had been sidelined, which already tells you the lineage was messy. This was not a triumphant succession. It was a salvage operation inside a failing weapons culture, trying to outclass the Mouse without paying the full cost of inventing a whole new monster. By early 1945, a hull was being assembled, but on low priority and with minimal manpower. So the machine, often described as Germany's near-operational supertank, was, in practice, a giant shell being pieced together while the war closed over it. You can picture the scene. Spring mud in the test area. American soldiers walking around the hull. No turret. No combat-ready battalion. No field trials proving the concept under fire. Just massive steel, partly complete, carrying the outline of an argument Germany no longer had the time or capacity to finish. The E-100 had enough physical reality to photograph well and enough incompleteness to mislead almost everyone who saw those photographs later. The important question is not whether the E-100 was impressive. It was. The question is how real it ever became as a weapon. If real means engineers drew it, yes. If real means steel was assembled into a prototype hull at Haustenbeck, yes. If real means Germany was on the edge of fielding a combat-ready super-heavy tank that could materially alter the armored war in 1945, the evidence goes cold, fast. No completed turret, no service entry, no combat firing, no deployment. No proof that its transport, maintenance, and operational problems had been solved rather than postponed. The machine crossed the line from paper to metal, but not from metal to war. The British understood that difference. After the Americans found the vehicle in April 1945, the captured hull was later examined under British control. It survived long enough to be evaluated, photographed, discussed. Long enough to keep feeding the legend. But in the 1950s, it was scrapped. Not preserved as the lost key to future armored dominance, not rebuilt into the terror weapon of alternate history fantasies. Cut up after inspection, like evidence that had given all it could. So the E-100 was neither pure fiction nor a near-missed battlefield revolution. It was something more revealing than either. A half-built attempt to industrialize excess. A tank sold as practical by the standards of insanity. That is why it sits so awkwardly in the story of German wonder weapons. The myth says this was a super tank that almost arrived. The scene at Haustenbeck says something else. By the time American soldiers walked around that unfinished hull in April 1945, the weapon was already telling the truth about itself before anyone touched it. It was not waiting for battle. It was waiting for inspection. Number 9. HS-293 Guided Bomb. On August 25, 1943, over the Bay of Biscay, a Dornier DO-217E-5 flew toward British anti-submarine ships carrying a weapon that broke one of the oldest rules of bombing. Release usually meant goodbye. Not here. Under Herbert Wagner's design, this bomb had to be watched, corrected, and flown all the way down. The HS-293 was a glide bomb with a rocket booster and radio control. Not a shell, not a torpedo. A small, one-way aircraft built around 3 numbers that mattered more than any slogan: release, visibility, control. If any one of those failed, the whole idea failed with it. Production was ordered in November 1941. Mass production began in January 1942. Deliveries reached the Luftwaffe in early 1943. So this was not a late fantasy sketched in the ruins. It arrived while Germany still had enough air power to try precision over the sea. That timing matters because the HS-293 was only as good as the conditions around it. The weapon itself was one machine. The kill chain was several: bomber, crew, radio link, line of sight, and a target still alive at the end of the glide. Look at how it worked in practice. The bomb was carried beneath the aircraft. It was released from standoff range so the bomber did not have to fly directly over a ship's guns. Then the rocket booster lit, giving the weapon speed after separation. After that initial push, the HS-293 became a glider. The operator in the aircraft steered it by radio while keeping it in sight. That is the part that made it modern and fragile at the same time. The bomber could stay farther away, yes, but it could not simply turn and leave. It had to keep flying a path that let one man continue to see the weapon and the target together. You drop, and you are still committed. That is the forensic clue at the center of the HS-293. Its warhead mattered. Its wings mattered. But the real mechanism was human attention, measured in seconds. A moving aircraft had to hold position long enough for another moving object to be guided onto a third moving object on the sea. One radio-controlled bomb sounds neat on paper. In the air, it meant the launch aircraft stayed exposed longer than an ordinary bomber would want to. So the true target was never just the ship below. It was time. Could the Germans buy enough of it before fighters arrived, before gunners found the range, before the link failed? On that first combat day in the Bay of Biscay, the answer was yes. German bombers attacked British anti-submarine forces and sank ships including HMS Egret. That result was not just a proof of engineering, it was a proof of geometry. Enough distance to survive, enough visibility to guide, enough calm in the air picture for the crew to finish the shot. The effect was immediate, because the old naval equation had shifted. A ship could now be struck by a bomb that did not fall dumb and straight, but bent toward it after release. You are on the deck, scanning the sky, and the thing coming at you is no longer obeying the usual rules. So the HS-293 spread from debut to reputation very quickly. In the Mediterranean, where convoy routes, troop ships, and escort vessels packed targets into predictable lanes, it became one of the sharpest German answers to Allied sea power. But the numbers here need to be handled carefully. Guided weapons create a myth almost by default. One spectacular hit can make the whole system look unstoppable. Yet this is where the central question of these wonder weapons starts to bite. Are you measuring the machine, or the window in which the enemy had not yet learned how to break it? On November 2, 1943, that distinction turned lethal aboard HMT Rona. The ship was a troop transport in the Mediterranean. German aircraft attacked with more than 24 glide bombs. Only one hit. One. But one was enough. The HS-293 struck Rona, and the losses were catastrophic. 1,015 U.S. soldiers killed, plus 134 British officers, Australian officers, and Indian crewmen. In raw arithmetic, it is one of the deadliest American losses at sea in the war. And it came from a weapon whose success rate in that attack, by simple count, was not high. That is what makes the HS-293 so hard to read if you only look at headlines. More than 24 used, one hit. But that single hit tore a hole in the official language around experimental and special weapons. Precision does not need to be frequent to be consequential. It needs to land once, on the right ship, at the right moment. So the bomb's battlefield record is split between two truths that seem to cancel each other out, but do not. It was not reliably dominant, and it was deadly enough to force immediate respect. Now go back to the aircraft guiding it. This is where the numbers stop being about bombs and start being about survivability. The operator had to remain visually involved after release. The radio link had to hold. The bomber had to avoid interception long enough to nurse the weapon onto the target. That meant the HS-293 depended less on a perfect bomb than on imperfect skies. In 1943, when Allied fighter cover and electronic countermeasures were still uneven, that dependence could be hidden. But once fighters improved and jamming improved, the weak point became obvious. Not the nose, not the wings. The aircraft, still carrying the man who had to fly the bomb by remote. So the wonder part had an expiry date built into it. Every successful attack taught the Allies what to protect, what to jam, and where to place air cover. Every minute the launch bombers stayed visible increased the cost of using the weapon again. This is why the HS-293 belongs in the same larger pattern as so many wartime superweapons. The mechanism works, but the ecosystem around it collapses. Because once they do work, everyone immediately starts building the method to make sure they never work that way again. Officially, the HS-293 was a guided bomb, a controlled solution to the problem of hitting ships from outside the worst of their defenses. On paper, that description is correct. In practice, it was a temporary bargain. Trade one ship below for one bomber forced to linger above, tied to a radio link and a line of sight that the enemy was learning, month by month, how to cut. The HS-293 was a precision weapon that only looked decisive while the battlefield around it was still too surprised to answer. Number 8. V1 Flying Bomb. A bomb that arrived on a timetable, then taught London to listen for silence. On the night of June 12 to 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day, the first V1 flying bombs crossed into southern England. Over the city, people heard them before they saw them. The harsh buzz of a pulse jet, a mechanical drone hanging in the air like an insect with a grudge. Then the sound stopped. That was the worst part. If the engine cut out over your street, the bomb was no longer far away. It was in free fall. The weapon's logic was brutally simple. Germany had built a cruise missile with an approximate range of 150 miles, a 2,100-pound high-explosive warhead, and a cruising speed of roughly 375 to 400 miles per hour. It flew low, usually around 2,000 to 4,000 feet. At first it launched from ramps on the French coast, later from sites in the Netherlands. It was not built to win dogfights. It was built to arrive over a city that thought the worst of the air war had already passed. Picture the one outcome the Germans needed most. Picture the V1 as Nazi propaganda tried to sell it. Not just a terror weapon, but a city killer that could keep pace with the weeks after Normandy, when Allied supply lines were still stretching across France and every division mattered. If the weapon had been accurate enough, reliable enough, and launched in enough volume from the start, London would have faced a different kind of pressure. Not isolated raids, but routine. Sirens at breakfast, shattered windows at noon, fires at dusk, and the constant knowledge that the next buzzing engine might land on your block. The V1 did not need perfect accuracy to matter. It only had to make people live around the chance that it might hit them. The first attack on London came on June 13, 1944. After that, the campaign widened. By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe had launched 22,000 V1 missiles overall. More than 30,000 were produced in 1944 and 1945. Each one had the same grim task: fly straight, fly cheap, and make distance feel useless. The weapon was not arriving from a bomber crew risking itself over the target. It came from ramps, from hidden positions, from machines that could be readied, fired, and replaced faster than a city could calm down. The sound mattered. Maybe not officially, but in practice, the buzz became the weapon's signature. Londoners learned the difference between the drone overhead and the silence after it. The buzz meant it was still out there. The silence meant it might already be above you. That tiny break in the engine's scream turned a missile into a psychological weapon. Not the explosion, the second before it. The Allies adapted because they had to. Anti-aircraft guns thickened around the capital. Barrage balloons filled the sky. Fighters went up to intercept the missiles. Launch sites were bombed. Every layer of defense showed the same thing. The V1 had found a real weakness, not in the sky, but in the need to defend it. If a weapon can make you spend shells, fuel, pilots, and sleep just to answer it, then part of its job is already done. Its longest shadow may not have fallen on Britain at all. It may have fallen on everyone who copied the idea. The United States reverse-engineered the design fast enough to produce the JB-2 in 1944. That is the afterlife of a failed wonder weapon. It loses the war it was meant to decide, then survives in other people's workshops. The battlefield gives one verdict. The engineering office gives another. The V1 was not a clean failure. It was a test of how fast defenses could learn. A test of how much destruction an inaccurate missile could still produce. A test of whether distance still protected a city once a machine could fly itself there. It exposed a new rule of war. If you can reach a target without a pilot, perfection is not required. You need enough fear, enough volume, and enough impact to make the other side build a shield around the sky. That is where the V1 fits in this story, the point where the promise of the wonder weapon starts to rot from the inside. It was not the miracle Germany wanted. It was still dangerous enough to change how other countries thought about air defense, radar, interception, and long-range attack. The proof was not only in the blast, it was in the sound Londoners learned to dread. The buzz stopped. Then the bomb fell. Number 7. V2 rocket. On September 8, 1944, a German Army V2 rose from a mobile launch site near Wassenaar in the Netherlands and climbed faster than any British defense could matter. No fighter could catch it. No gun could reach it. In less than 5 minutes, at about 6:43 p.m., it came down on Staveley Road in Chiswick, West London, near house number 5. 3 people were killed. 17 were seriously wounded. One of the dead was Rosemary Clark, 3 years old. A crater opened in the street. Gas mains broke. Water mains broke. Houses folded inward. Witnesses could not warn anyone in time because there was no warning to hear first. The V2 was supersonic. The explosion reached people before the sound of the rocket ever could. London had learned to listen for the V1's engine and to fear the silence when it cut out. This was different. No buzz, no cutout, no final second to understand. The first sign was impact. That is why one document matters so much here. Not a blueprint. Not a speech. A damage report. A police-style record of a street that had been ordinary at 6:42 and broken open at 6:43. These are the artifacts that tell the truth about wonder weapons. Not what they promised in briefing rooms, but what they actually did when steel met brick, pipe, pavement, and flesh. In that first London report, one thing already does not fit the myth. The technology is decades ahead. The result is a smashed residential road. Start with the machine itself. About 46 feet tall, roughly 56,000 pounds of thrust at launch, a top speed around 3,400 miles per hour, a range of about 200 miles, a ceiling of 50 to 60 miles, high enough to brush the edge of space before dropping back down in a ballistic arc. It carried a warhead of about 1 ton. In engineering terms, it was astonishing. This was the first long-range guided ballistic missile used in war. In strategic terms, though, Germany had built a weapon that could do something almost no one else on Earth could do, but could not do the one thing that mattered most by late 1944: change the war. That tension runs through every surviving photo and report. You look at the V2 on its launcher, and you are seeing the future. Liquid fuel, gyroscopic guidance, mobile launch crews, a missile that turns distance into a math problem. But you look at where it landed, and the future suddenly looks crude. It could outrun every defense, yes, but it was too inaccurate to strike decisive targets with consistent effect. A wonder weapon is supposed to compress effort. The V2 expanded it. It burned resources Germany no longer had. It used transport networks under constant pressure. It demanded specialist crews, alcohol, liquid oxygen, maintenance, concealment, and launch preparation, all for a weapon that arrived late and often hit the wrong thing. The records get darker when you leave London and follow the paper trail back to where the rockets came from. By the time more than 2,600 V2s had been launched at London, Antwerp, Liège, Brussels, Paris, and Luxembourg, roughly 6,000 had been produced. That sounds like industrial scale. It was. But buried inside those production numbers is the real cost. At Mittelwerk and the linked Mittelbau-Dora camp system, about 20,000 prisoners died in roughly a year and a half. Starvation, beatings, disease, execution, exhaustion underground. Some estimates attribute about half of the deaths at Mittelbau-Dora directly to the V2 program. The arithmetic of the weapon begins to invert. More people died making it than were killed by its military use. That is the core of what the V2 was. A miracle of propulsion attached to a system of industrial murder. A weapon so advanced it pointed toward the space age, but so wasteful and so misdirected that it consumed its own labor force faster than it produced strategic effect. If this video keeps circling the same question, why the weapons that worked best were so often the ones later banned or buried, the V2 offers a brutal variation. Some weapons are buried not because they failed technically, but because their success is fused to what made them unforgivable. Still, the rocket did kill. In London, people could do almost nothing about it. In Antwerp, where the Allies depended on the port to keep armies supplied after the liberation of the city, Germany found a target that made strategic sense on paper. Hit Antwerp hard enough, and you might choke the fuel, ammunition, and food moving to the front. So the V2 campaign shifted there with intensity. But the documents do not behave the way the myth says they should. The rocket could reach the city. It could terrify the population. It could strike without warning. But accuracy remained poor, and poor accuracy in a dense city means civilians absorb the error. On December 16, 1944, one V2 hit the Cinema Rex in Antwerp during a showing packed with people. 567 were killed. 291 were injured. It was the deadliest known V2 strike of the war. A single rocket had done catastrophic damage, but even here the logic breaks apart. This was horror, not control. Terror, not precision. The port that mattered remained a huge distributed target system of docks, warehouses, roads, cranes, rail links, depots. A weapon this inaccurate could punish a city while still failing to reliably paralyze the infrastructure that made the city useful. There is another layer in the paperwork, what the Germans thought they were hitting versus what they were actually told. British censorship and deception shaped what information escaped about impact points. Reports were manipulated. Public details were restricted. Intelligence channels were fed selective signals. The exact effect on German aiming is still debated, but the fact of the effort matters on its own. Even against a missile too fast to intercept, the battle was still being fought in information, not in the sky, in reports, in newspapers, in what the enemy believed his own weapon was doing. You can feel the age changing there. With the V1, Londoners listened. With the V2, they investigated rubble. With both, governments learned that defense was no longer only a matter of guns and aircraft. It was also deception, censorship, dispersion, repair. The missile age did not begin with a clean military triumph. It began with a blast report on an ordinary street and a machine that proved a city could be struck from the edge of space, but not decisively controlled. That is the trap inside the V2 story. As a weapon of war, it failed. As a weapon of the future, it succeeded too well. Its designers would be studied, its principles would be copied, its shape would reappear in arsenals and launch pads far beyond the Reich that built it. So when you open the report from Staveley Road, what does not fit is not the damage. It is the timeline. The crater is 1944. The idea inside it is decades ahead. The V2 did not win a war. It opened an era. Number 6. Schwerer Gustav. In March 1936, Adolf Hitler walked into Krupp and asked a simple question with a monstrous answer behind it. What kind of gun could crack France's frontier forts? He wanted something that could smash concrete, bury bunkers, and make the Maginot Line look fragile. Krupp answered with a weapon that barely seemed real. Schwerer Gustav, an 800mm railway cannon, one of the largest rifled guns ever used in combat. The scale pushes past artillery and into something closer to construction. Complete, it weighed about 1,350 metric tons. Not a typo. 1,350,000 kilograms of steel, machinery, barrel, cradle, and rail structure so massive it stopped feeling like transport and started feeling like architecture. Moving it took 25 freight cars for the gun alone, before the crew, ammunition, workshops, and extra machinery trailing behind it. You did not roll this weapon into place. It arrived in pieces and forced the landscape to adapt to it. That mattered because Schwerer Gustav could not simply turn. It had no real horizontal traverse. To aim left or right, the Germans had to move the entire gun along a specially built curved railway track. The target crossed the sight picture the way a ship moves past a dock, except the dock was the gun, and the gun was longer than a building. It had to be dismantled, hauled in trainloads, and rebuilt by cranes. About 250 men could assemble it in roughly 54 hours. That was only the part you could see. Thousands more prepared the rails, the firing position, the support lines, the camouflage, the security, the air defense, and the locomotives. The gun needed more than a crew. It needed a labor force the size of a small city. That was the ideal version. Reality came late. By the time Schwerer Gustav was ready for the war it had been designed to fight, Germany had already bypassed the French frontier forts. The weapon had been built for a problem that was already gone. So the giant did not go west. It went east. In spring 1942, Heavy Artillery Unit 672 brought it to Crimea and set it up near Bakhchi Sarai for the assault on Sevastopol. The city sat behind deep defenses, bunkers, batteries, and underground magazines. It was the kind of target that made planners reach for extreme solutions. On June 5, 1942, the gun opened fire. The first shots must have sounded less like artillery than like some industrial god waking up. Its shells weighed 7,100 kilograms in the concrete-piercing version and 4,800 kilograms in the high-explosive version. One could reach about 38 kilometers, the other about 47. The numbers were so extreme, they became part of the weapon's legend. For a short time, the legend looked real. Its most famous hit struck an ammunition depot protected under Severnaya Bay, a deep target, a hidden target. The kind of impact that makes generals lean forward and engineers nod as if the calculations had finally paid off. The gun also shelled Soviet batteries and forts around the city. It could do the job it had been built for. Keeping it in action was another matter. While the gun was making an impression in command centers, the machine behind it was chewing through time, labor, and logistics at a pace that belonged to an older kind of war. Every shot was expensive. Every correction took time. Every movement meant railway work, crane work, gun crew work, and protection work. The weapon was a masterpiece of overbuilding, and that was its curse. It had to be guarded like a strategic asset, fed like a siege camp, and handled like a machine straining under its own ambition. At Sevastopol, it fired only 48 shells before the ammunition was gone and the barrel was worn. 48, not 480. Not enough to terrorize a front for months. Not enough to justify the scale of the beast. Enough to show that a giant gun could still damage a city. Not enough to show that it could win one. Sevastopol fell on July 4, 1942, but Schwerer Gustav did not deliver that victory by itself. The city fell because armies, air power, siege tactics, and attrition did the work one impossible cannon could not. The gun became a symbol more than a solution, a monument in motion, a prestige object with a muzzle. The Reich had asked for a machine to break fortresses, and Krupp built one so large it had to be managed like moving infrastructure. Then the war changed around it. Schwerer Gustav ended up doing what failed Wunderweapons often did best, impressing the people who built them while struggling to matter on the battlefield. You can hear the contradiction in the numbers. 800 millimeters, 1,350 tons, 25 freight cars, 250 men to assemble it, thousands more to support it, 48 shots. That is not the shape of a weapon built to dominate a fast-moving war. It is the shape of an answer that arrived after the question had changed. The detail that says the most is this. Schwerer Gustav was built to destroy fixed defenses, yet it was trapped by a fixed idea. Heavy steel, slow setup, limited traverse, immense preparation. It could reach nearly 47 kilometers. It still could not keep up with a war that had already moved past it. One German report called it the most powerful gun ever deployed. Another description was colder, a weapon of propaganda. That line lands harder than the shell weights or the barrel size. By the time the firing stopped, the story of Schwerer Gustav had already outgrown its battlefield effect. It stood as proof that Germany could build the impossible. Battlefields do not reward the impossible. They reward what arrives on time, what can move, what can be supplied, and what can survive the next hour. Schwerer Gustav did not fail because it was too small. It failed because it was too large to fit inside the war it was meant to solve. The shell fell. The fortress shook. The war kept moving. Number 5. Sondergerät 500 Jägerfaust. On April 10, 1945, a pilot at Brandis climbs into a Messerschmitt Me-163B with paperwork that belongs to the end of the war. A tiny fighter, a desperate airfield, and a weapon whose designation sounds more like a filing label than a promise. Sondergerät 500, Jägerfaust, Special Device 500, Hunter's Fist. The machine around him already feels wrong for the job. The Me-163 is a rocket interceptor, small and violent, built to rise fast and hit hard, not loiter under a bomber stream. But the ordinary way of attacking heavy bombers has become murder. Come in from behind and you fly into layered defensive fire. Close from the side and the formation cuts at you from more than one angle. So this aircraft has been turned into something stranger. Not a chaser, an ambush. Around 6 operational machines have been modified for it. Roughly 12 Me-163B-1s are said to have been fitted in total. The fittings sit hidden in the airframe like a trick. 50mm projectiles, not forward, upward. The pilot is not meant to line up a gun sight on a tail. He is meant to slide directly beneath the bomber, so close that the silhouette above him does the aiming for him. An optical sensor watches for that shadow. When the dark shape crosses into place, the weapon fires straight up into the belly of the aircraft where bombers are weakest. On the ground, the idea is brutally clean. In the cockpit, it must feel insane. The canopy comes down. The airfield at Brandis is already tense with the flat, hurried rhythm of April 1945. By then, Germany has almost no margin left for experiments, but this is exactly when experiments become combat systems. There were tests before this, first on a Focke-Wulf FW-190, then on the Comet itself through 1944 and 1945, enough to convince somebody that the system is ready to leave the workshop and meet a formation of real bombers. That is how late war logic works now. If it functions on the range, it goes to the front. If it reaches the front, it is already too late. The pilot credited in several sources is Fritz Kelb. He settles into an aircraft that burns fuel fast, lands badly, and gives him only a short window to do everything right. The Me-163 was always an all-or-nothing machine. Now the all-or-nothing has become even narrower. He does not need a conventional firing pass. He needs something harder. He needs geometry. He needs timing. He needs to place himself under a bomber in daylight, beneath an enemy formation over Leipzig, with enough precision for a mechanical eye to decide the moment. The launch is the violent part. The climb is the urgent part. Then the strange calm begins. You are no longer chasing open sky. You are looking up. Somewhere ahead, the raid is moving toward Leipzig in daylight. The bombers are not one aircraft, but a structure. Boxes, lanes, crossing fields of fire, engines droning with the confidence that comes from altitude and numbers. From below, the undersides flatten into dark plains against the brighter sky. That is the whole logic of Jägerfaust, not speed alone, not pilot reflex alone. Shape, contrast, distance measured in fractions of a second. Kelb brings the Comet underneath. There is no long duel here, no circling dogfight. The aircraft does not belong in that kind of combat. It climbs, positions, and for a moment the entire engagement becomes vertical, metal over metal. One bomber above, one rocket fighter below. The vulnerable place is not the tail or cockpit glazing, but the belly, where a burst from beneath can tear through structure, fuel, or bomb load before the gunners even understand where the attack came from. That matters because weapons like this only make sense when ordinary interception has become almost suicidal. So the pilot is not trying to outshoot the formation. He is trying to pass through one blind spot that exists for a second and then vanishes. The bomber fills the canopy. No one in that Halifax crew is watching the space directly under them with any real comfort, because almost nobody attacks like this. That is the ugly elegance of the idea. The best angle is the one doctrine barely expects. Kelb keeps the comet under the bomber's path. The optical trigger sees what it was designed to see, not a target in the old sense, but a shadowed mass crossing overhead. Then the weapon answers on its own. The projectiles go upward. At 50 millimeters, they are not rifle rounds and not cannon shells in the usual cinematic sense either. They are compact punches directed into the thinnest, most vulnerable face of a heavy aircraft. There is no heroic broadside, no tracers arcing dramatically ahead of the nose. Just a snap from below. The kind of attack that can look almost impossible from outside because it breaks every instinct of air combat storytelling. For a second, nothing resolves. Then the bomber does. Something gives in the Halifax above him. The clean formation line breaks. A heavy aircraft that was level a moment ago is suddenly wrong in the air, losing the quiet certainty that keeps bombers alive. One source chain calls it a Lancaster. Older retellings even drift into B-17 territory. But the more careful versions land on a Halifax. And in scenes like this, you can feel why the record blurs. April 1945. A collapsing front. A bizarre weapon. A split-second firing pass from directly underneath. The paper trail is as thin as the closing weeks of the Reich. But the kill itself remains. The bomber is hit. The Jägerfaust, or at least this Jägerfaust installation on this day over Leipzig, has done what it was built to do. It has turned the comet from a rocket dart into a trap sprung from below. For one instant, the absurdity works. Inside the cockpit, clarity is the one thing Kelb does not get. A Me-163 does not linger to watch the full ending. Fuel burns away. Speed bleeds into survival calculations. The sky around him is still full of enemy aircraft, and whatever just happened above may never be recorded cleanly by the men falling through it. He has only the glimpse. The bomber struck, the formation disturbed, the impossible mechanism proving itself in combat at the exact moment the war is collapsing around it. Below, Germany is coming apart. Above, one weapon has finally worked. The comet slips away. The Halifax starts to fall. And in the smoke and daylight over Leipzig, the one documented success of the Jägerfaust is already disappearing into the kind of evidence that ends wars. Half seen, badly filed, and gone before anyone can look twice. Number 4. Mittelwerk Underground Factory. In the summer of 1943, Albert Speer's rocket ministry was running out of daylight and running out of options. On the night of August 17th to 18th, RAF bombers hit Peenemünde, where Germany's V2 program had been built in the open. After that, the answer was not better armor, it was depth. The rockets went underground, into the Konstein mountain near Nordhausen, where existing tunnels were expanded into a hidden industrial labyrinth called Mittelwerk. When the order came to make that mountain produce miracle weapons, one man was already being pulled into the dark with it. His name was Werner von Braun, and by 1943, he was no longer just a designer sketching impossible machines on paper. He was the face of a rocket program that had survived the bombing raid, survived the bureaucrats, and now had to survive the war itself. On September 21, 1943, Speer's ministry created Mittelwerk GmbH to run the plant, and von Braun's rockets were assigned a new home under a mountain that had never been meant to hold an assembly line. The official story was simple. Move the work underground, protect it from bombs, keep the V2 alive. The tunnels could not be dug, cleaned, and widened by engineers alone. They needed bodies. Prisoners from Buchenwald were shipped in to blast rock, haul debris, and carve out the space where the rockets would be built. The factory did not begin with machinery. It began with men collapsing under it. Von Braun understood the scale immediately. This was not a clean relocation. It was a race between production and ruin, and the tunnels were already behind. The mountain air was cold, damp, and stale. Fresh air barely moved. Dust hung in the passages. Water seeped through the walls. Everything about the site said temporary, but the rockets arriving there were being treated as if they could change the war. That tension defined Mittelwerk from the start. It was supposed to be secret. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to preserve the weapon from destruction. Instead, it was being assembled inside a place that was destroying the people forced to build it. Von Braun was there, or near enough to know what the place really was. He was not the man with the hammer or the drill, but he was part of the system that made the mountain useful. He moved through an industrial world where army officers, Speer's ministry, and the SS were all fighting for control of the program. That bureaucratic struggle mattered because it decided who got the labor, who got the authority, and who got to pretend not to see the cost. The army wanted the rocket. Speer wanted output. The SS wanted prisoners. Mittelwerk became the point where those ambitions met, and the prisoners lost every time. By early 1944, the first rockets were coming out. On January 1, 1944, Mittelwerk delivered its first 3 V2s, and all of them had serious defects. That detail matters because it cuts straight through the fantasy of the wonder weapon. These were not flawless machines emerging from a secret technical triumph. They were damaged products from a broken factory, pushed out under pressure before the system was ready. The tunnels were still filthy and dangerous. The machinery was incomplete. Men were still living underground for weeks at a time, surrounded by concrete, rock dust, fuel fumes, and the smell of sweat trapped where sunlight could not reach. The rockets were being made in a place that was killing the people making them, and the longer the program continued, the more normal that horror became. By spring 1944, prisoners were still mostly underground in unstable passages with little daylight or fresh air. By fall 1944, full missile production had begun. At least 12,000 prisoners were trapped in the standing camp population once production was in earnest. As the output rose, so did the death toll. The wider Dora Mittelbau system would kill up to 25,000 prisoners, with about 20,000 deaths attributed to Mittelwerk's conditions in roughly a year and a half. Those numbers are not abstract. They are the real engine of the site. The rockets did not run on electricity alone. They ran on exhaustion. They ran on beatings, hunger, disease, suffocation, and men who were expected to keep working until the mountain swallowed them. Von Braun has often been remembered as the brilliant engineer who reached for space. Inside Mittelwerk, that story becomes harder to keep clean. He was one of the people who helped bring the rocket program into the mountain, and the mountain was not neutral ground. It was a system built around forced labor, controlled by the SS, and tuned for production through terror. The facility's promise was secrecy and survival. Its reality was that every extra rocket came with more dead prisoners beneath it. That is the part the word factory hides. A factory suggests tools, shifts, schedules, output. Mittelwerk was all of that, and it was also a grave dug in stages, one tunnel blast at a time. That is why the site mattered beyond the V2 itself. The war did not merely hide the weapon, it buried the people who made it possible. When American forces reached Nordhausen in April 1945, they found a system that had been sold as technical necessity and delivered as mass death. The factory was officially a place of production. In practice, it was a concentration camp labor machine with rockets coming out the end. Officially, it was an underground plant meant to protect Germany's future. In reality, it was a mountain full of prisoners, defects, and corpses. And the difference between those two versions is the entire story. Number 3. Project P.1000 Ratte. In June 1942, Adolf Hitler was shown an idea so absurd it sounded less like a tank and more like a naval joke dragged onto dry land. The proposal came from Krupp circles, and it had a name that already gave away the fantasy behind it. P.1000 Ratte. 1,000 in the designation, 1,000 tons in the plan. A machine so large it was meant to carry battleship logic across a battlefield, as if the answer to Allied air power and Soviet armor was to build a steel island and call it maneuverable. The pitch was simple on paper. Give it two 28-centimeter naval guns and a massive turret, bolt on heavy anti-aircraft weapons, and protect it with armor thick enough to shrug off almost anything short of a direct hit from the kind of weapons Germany was already struggling to produce. Then, move the whole thing on tracks. Not small tracks, not clever tracks, but a chassis so immense it would have needed marine engines and custom infrastructure just to exist. This was not a tank in the normal sense. It was a battleship that had lost its sea lanes and decided to invade Europe by itself. The myth of the Ratte usually starts there, with the headline number, 1,000 tons. But that number is not the story. It is the trap. Once you look at the mechanics, the thing starts to collapse under its own weight before it ever moves an inch. A vehicle that large would not simply be heavy. It would be punishingly heavy on every part of the war machine around it. Bridges would fail. Rail transport would be nearly impossible. Roads would become assumptions, not routes. Fuel consumption would be staggering. Maintenance would be constant. Recovery, if it ever bogged down, would be a nightmare. A machine this size did not just need protection, it needed a country willing to reorganize itself around its movement. Germany in 1942 did not have that luxury. The armament alone tells you how the concept worked in the minds of its designers. Two 28-centimeter naval guns were often cited as the main weapons, the kind of caliber associated with warships and coastal bombardment, not armored vehicles pushing through mud. Those guns were supposed to give the Ratte overwhelming firepower, the ability to smash fortifications and dominate any target it could see. But that is the key phrase, any target it could see. A machine this enormous would have been impossible to hide, hard to disguise, and easy to spot from the air long before it came into range. In an era when Allied aircraft were becoming more dangerous by the month, visibility was not a side issue. It was the death sentence built into the blueprint. So the Ratte was meant to solve vulnerability with scale. Bigger armor, bigger guns, bigger engines, bigger everything. But scale does not erase exposure. It multiplies it. The propulsion plans make that even clearer. Different sources cite different options, including 8 2,000 horsepower Daimler-Benz marine engines or 2 8,400 horsepower MAN marine diesels. Either way, the logic was the same. This was naval engineering trying to force its way into land warfare. Marine power plants, marine thinking, marine assumptions about size and output. The chassis would have been so massive that the vehicle's internal systems, weight distribution, cooling, and drivetrain would all have been fighting the same battle at once. More power would not have meant freedom. It would have meant more machinery just to keep the fantasy alive. The Ratte was not designed from the battlefield outward. It was designed from a wish outward. By the summer of 1942, Germany was already deep in a pattern of escalation. The Maus was emerging. Other oversized projects were moving through the system. The idea behind them was seductive. If the enemy can outnumber you, outproduce you, and outmaneuver you, then build something they cannot answer. Build something so terrifying that it changes the rules. But rules do not disappear because a vehicle looks enormous on a drawing board. They become stricter. Weight still matters. Distance still matters. Logistics still matter. The war still has to be fed. That is where the Ratte starts to fail as a weapon and becomes interesting as evidence, because the failure was not hidden. It was obvious almost immediately. By early 1943, the project was dropped. Not because someone had solved the engineering, not because a prototype had proven the concept. It was cancelled because it had already run into the wall that every wonder weapon eventually meets: reality. A weapon can be spectacular and still be useless. It can impress a leader in a conference room and fail the first question a supply officer asks. How does it cross a bridge? How does it turn? How does it refuel? How does it survive the air attack that will certainly find it? How do you build one, let alone many, while a total war is already strangling your industry? There was no clean answer to any of that. That is why the Ratte never became a battlefield machine. It remained what it had always been at heart, a technical fever dream dressed up as military necessity. Krupp's studies may have centered on a vast turret and a hull that would have dwarfed everything around it, but the numbers betrayed the fantasy from the start. 1,000 tons does not suggest a breakthrough. It suggests a problem so large that the language of normal weapon design has already broken down. You can picture the thing the way the planners probably did, not as a tank, but as an armored monument rolling forward under its own thunder. Now shrink that image back into wartime Germany. Bombed rail lines, fuel shortages, Allied skies, bridges under strain. Mechanics staring at components too large to move by ordinary means. The great machine is no longer terrifying. It is stranded before it ever reaches the front. That is what makes the P.1000 Ratte so revealing. It shows what happened when the dream of the wonder weapon stopped being about military value and became about intimidation by scale alone. It was supposed to be the ultimate land battleship. In practice, it was a proposal that depended on a level of industrial freedom Germany no longer had, and maybe never had at all. The giant never rolled, because the war had already moved past the point where giants could save it. What was left was a paper monster, a 1,000-ton silhouette that looked unstoppable until you asked how it was supposed to cross a river. And then it was just a very expensive answer to a question no battlefield had asked. Number 2. FA-223 Drache. And this is where the war runs into a machine it was never built to handle. On August 11, 1940, at the airfield in Trier, Heinrich Focke's FA-223 Drache lifted off for the first time. Not a toy, not a dead-end prototype. A twin-rotor helicopter with one engine driving both rotors, built to carry cargo, rescue crews, reconnaissance teams, and men out of mountains trucks could never reach. The early requirement around Focke's work had called for roughly 700 kilograms of payload, and the Drache was meant to make that number real. That matters because most World War II helicopters were still trying to prove they could stay in the air at all. This one was already being asked to move the war's weight. The FA-223 grew out of the smaller FA-61 and the 6-seat FA-266 Hornisse concept, and the design choices tell you exactly what Germany was chasing: stability, lift, control. 2 rotors, one on each side, each canceling the other's torque, so the machine did not need the tail rotor system that would later become standard on conventional helicopters. In the air, that meant a strange sight even by wartime standards: a craft with a 39-foot rotor span, a long fuselage, and a shape that looked less like an aircraft than a mechanical answer to a problem no one had solved before. But the point was not appearance, it was use. The Drache was built to hover over wrecks, to lower lines to stranded crews, to land where no runway existed, and to pull weight out of places that had no business letting anything fly at all. Then the war did what it always did to German projects that needed patience. It broke the schedule. It broke the factories. It broke the chain between a good idea and enough finished airframes to matter. Allied bombing hit production. Plans shifted. Facilities scattered. The aircraft that should have moved from promise to production kept getting pushed back into proof-of-concept territory. By the time the war was ending, only about 20 FA-223s had been built in total. 20. For a machine meant to show Germany the future of vertical lift, that number is almost brutal in its smallness. It is not a fleet. It is a warning. But the warning came wrapped in evidence. The Drache did not just sit in tests doing circles over an airfield. It worked. It hauled loads. It flew rescue missions. It proved that rotary wing aircraft could do jobs that fixed-wing planes simply could not. In the mountains, that was everything. A helicopter did not need a strip cleared of snow or rubble. It needed a patch of air and enough fuel to fight gravity for a few minutes at a time. That difference sounds abstract until you put it over a landscape of rock and wreckage. Then it becomes the whole story. B-roll. Mountain rescue footage. Early helicopter test footage. Engineers around rotor systems. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe's Transportstaffel 40 at Mühldorf was operating FA-223s, and by then the machine had already slipped out of the category of curiosity. It had become proof. Not proof of victory, proof of utility. Proof that a helicopter could be more than a laboratory trick. The problem was scale. 1 aircraft can rescue a crew. 10 aircraft can rewrite a niche. 20 can only hint at a doctrine. The war demanded an industrial answer, but the Drache arrived in a country whose industry was being shredded from above and starved from below. So the aircraft kept doing something that should have made it famous, and instead made it tragic. It kept succeeding in places too small to save the program. There is a reason the Drache belongs in a story about failed wonder weapons, even though it was not a failure in the simple sense. It exposed the difference between technical success and wartime relevance. A machine can work and still lose. It can solve the problem in front of it and still arrive too late to shape the campaign. The FA-223 did exactly that. It demonstrated vertical lift before Germany had the industrial depth to mass produce it. It proved the concept before the bombers had finished erasing the factories that would have built its future. So the helicopter became one more German breakthrough trapped inside a collapsing war economy. Useful enough to matter, fragile enough to vanish. And the strangest part is what happened after the war. In September 1945, a post-war FA-223 flew across the English Channel. Not in a lab, not in a propaganda reel, but across open water, in the hands of the victors, watching what Germany had nearly turned into a fleet. That flight says almost everything. The machine was not a dead end. It was early. It was underbuilt. It was denied the production run that might have made it normal. The Drache did not fail because it was useless. It failed because Germany could not keep the sky clear long enough to build the machine that could survive the war above it. And the last fact is almost insulting in its simplicity. Only about 20 were ever made. Number 1. Panzer VIII Maus. 188 tons of steel, and not a single road in Europe was meant to carry it. In 1942, German planners watched Soviet heavy tanks grow larger and harder to kill. Ferdinand Porsche was handed a requirement that sounded less like a vehicle order and more like a dare. Build a super heavy tank. Make it survive anything. Make it hit back with something no existing armor could stop. So Porsche went to Krupp, and the project became the Panzer VIII Maus. At first, the paper design called for a 15-centimeter gun. Then the layout settled around a 12.8-centimeter KWK-44L/55, paired with a coaxial 7.5-centimeter KWK-44L/36.5. Not one gun, but two. A floating fortress on tracks. Picture the cleanest version of that dream. The Maus reaches the Eastern Front into one of those brutal tank battles where distance matters, where guns trade fire across broken ground, and every extra inch of armor buys another second of life. Nearly 200 tons of steel. A main gun that could punch through almost anything in the Soviet inventory. From far away, it would have looked invincible. The T-34s would have bounced. The anti-tank guns would have looked absurd. Even larger German armor would have seemed small beside it. In that fantasy, the Maus becomes a moving bunker, a siege wall with a turret, the kind of weapon that can hold a crossing, anchor a defensive line, and force the enemy to go around, or bring artillery heavy enough to drag the whole map into the fight. But the trap was inside the machine. The Maus was not only heavy, it was self-defeating. The weight kept climbing until the suspension had to be redesigned. Mobility became so poor that even the people building it struggled to move it between test sites. This was not a tank that could exploit a breakthrough. It was a tank that needed the war to slow down for it. Wars do not do that. On May 14, 1943, Hitler was shown the wooden mock-up. By then, the project had already become a symbol of German engineering in its most dangerous form. Brilliant on paper, late in practice, and obsessed with scale as if size itself could solve strategy. The Maus was supposed to outrun the technical clock, but the clock was already beating it. By late 1943, the first turretless prototype was testing. In 1944, the second followed. 2 prototypes completed, one with a real turret, one with a turret mock-up. That is, the whole program reduced to a shape on the ground. 2 immense machines, each too specialized to become a fleet, too expensive to become expendable, too late to matter in numbers. Even if the Maus had been easy to move, easy to supply, easy to maintain, that still would not have been enough. A 188-ton vehicle does not just fight. It demands roads, bridges, fuel, recovery equipment, transport planning, and time. It turns every kilometer into a logistics problem. In the coldest practical sense, the Maus would have won the kind of battle Germany could not afford to keep having. It might have destroyed whatever stood in front of it, but it would have consumed the system around it while doing so. A wonder weapon that needs a miracle every time it changes position is not a battlefield solution. It is a hostage to terrain. If the Maus had reached combat, it would not have entered as a nimble superweapon. It would have entered as a fixed event. Reconnaissance reports first, then dust clouds, then road closures and bridge demolitions left in its path. Artillery would have come next, mines on the approaches, fuel shortages, mechanical failure. And then the simplest fact of all. A vehicle this massive can be hunted by aircraft, by engineers, by enough explosives, and enough time. The tank could dominate a narrow patch of ground. It could not change the war. By July 1944, Hitler had ordered super-heavy tank development to stop. That was the point where the fantasy met the invoice. The Maus had absorbed time, steel, manpower, machine work, and design labor that Germany no longer had to spare. The war was shrinking around it. The concept was still growing. So the project died the way many German wonder weapons died, not in a blaze of enemy fire, but under the weight of its own ambition. Then came 1945. The Red Army advanced, and the Germans destroyed the prototypes rather than let them be captured intact. Even that was not enough to erase them. The Soviets later fused parts of the 2 wrecks into the preserved example now at Kubinka, a hybrid machine built from the remains of failure. The Maus could not become a weapon that changed the war, but it did become a monument to everything the war had made impossible. There is a rare Maus optical sight in the Tank Museum in Britain, one of the few original program components that survived outside the wrecks themselves. A tiny piece of precision from a vehicle built at monstrous scale. Maybe that is the right fragment to keep. Not the tank, not the fantasy, just the lens that was supposed to help aim a machine too large to save itself. Because the Maus was never really about armor thickness or gun caliber. It was about the belief that if a weapon was made extreme enough, reality would have to make room for it. It did not. Aus dem Maus-Projekt ist nichts geworden.